A possible explanation as to what they did with all the rubbish they gathered. "Made mud pies, I guess," grunted the captain. "More or less," agreed Jarvis. "They use it for food. Leroy thinks if they're part vegetable, you see, that's what they'd want, soil with organic remains in it to make it fertile. That's why they ground up sand and biopods and other growths all together, see?" "Dimly," countered Harrison. "How about the suicides?" Leroy had a hunch there, too. The suicides jump into the grinder when the mixture has too much sand and gravel. They throw themselves in to adjust the proportions. "Rats!" said Harrison disgustedly. "Why couldn't they bring in some extra branches from the outside?" "Because suicide is easier. You've got to remember that these creatures can't be judged by earthly standards. They probably don't feel pain, and they haven't got what we'd call individuality. Any intelligence they have is the property of the whole community. Like an ant heap. That's it. Ants are willing to die for their ant hill. So are these creatures." "So are men," observed the captain, "if it comes to that." "Yes, but men aren't exactly eager. It takes some emotion, like patriotism, to work 'em to the point of dying for their country. These things do it all in a day's work." He paused. "Well, we took some pictures of the dream beast and the barrel creatures, and then we started along. We sailed over Xanthus, keeping as close to the meridian of the Aries as we could, and pretty soon we crossed the trail of the pyramid builder, so we circled back to let Leroy take a look at it. And when we found it, we landed. The thing had completed just 2 rows of bricks since Tweel and I left it, and there it was, breathing in silicon and breathing out bricks as if it had an eternity to do it in, which it has. Leroy wanted to dissect it with a Boland explosive bullet, but I thought that anything that had lived for 10 million years was entitled to the respect due old age, so I talked him out of it. He peeped into the hole on top of it and nearly got beamed by the arm coming up with a brick, and then he chipped off a few pieces of it, which didn't disturb the creature a bit. He found the place I'd chipped, tried to see if there was any sign of healing, and decided he could tell better in 2 or 3,000 years, so he took a few shots of it and sailed on. Mid-afternoon we located the wreck of my rocket. Not a thing disturbed. We picked up my films and tried to decide what next. I wanted to find Tweel if possible. I figured from the fact of his pointing south that he lived somewhere near Thule. We plotted our route and judged that the desert we were in now was Thule 2. Thule 1 should be east of us. So, on a hunch, we decided to have a look at Thule 1, and away we buzzed. "Der Motors?" queried Poots, breaking his long silence. "For a wonder, we had no trouble, Carl. Your blast worked perfectly." So we hummed along pretty high to get a wider view, I'd say about 50,000 feet. Thule 2 spread out like an orange carpet, and after a while we came to the gray branch of the Mare Cronium that bounded it. That was narrow. We crossed it in half an hour, and there was Thule 1, same orange-hued desert as its mate. We veered south toward the Mare Australe and followed the edge of the desert, and toward sunset we spotted it. "Spotted?" echoed Poots. "What was spotted?" The desert was spotted, with buildings. Not one of the mud cities of the canals, although a canal went through it. From the map we figured the canal was a continuation of the one Schiaparelli called Ascanius. We were probably too high to be visible to any inhabitants of the city, but also too high for a good look at it, even with the glasses. However, it was nearly sunset anyway, so we didn't plan on dropping in. We circled the place. The canal went out into the Mare Australe, and there, glittering in the south, was the melting polar ice cap. The canal drained it. We could distinguish the sparkle of water in it. Off to the southeast, just at the edge of the Mare Australe, was a valley, the first irregularity I'd seen on Mars except the cliffs that bounded Xanthus and Thule 2. We flew over the valley. Jarvis paused suddenly and shuddered. Leroy, whose color had begun to return, seemed to pale. The chemist resumed. "Well, the valley looked all right then. Just a gray waste, probably full of crawlers like the others. We circled back over the city. Say, I want to tell you that place was, well, gigantic. It was colossal. At first I thought the size was due to that illusion I spoke of, you know, the nearness of the horizon. But it wasn't that. We sailed right over it, and you've never seen anything like it. But the sun dropped out of sight right then. I knew we were pretty far south, latitude 60, but I didn't know just how much night we'd have." Harrison glanced at the Schiaparelli chart. "About 60, eh?" he said. "Close to what corresponds to the Antarctic Circle. You'd have about 4 hours of night at this season. 3 months from now you'd have none at all." 3 months, echoed Jarvis, surprised. Then he grinned. Right, I forgot. The seasons here are twice as long as ours. Well, we sailed out into the desert about 20 miles, which put the city below the horizon in case we overslept. And there we spent the night. You're right about the length of it. We had about 4 hours of darkness, which left us fairly rested. We ate breakfast, called our location to you, and started over to have a look at the city. We sailed toward it from the east, and it loomed up ahead of us like a range of mountains. Lord, what a city! Not that New York mightn't have higher buildings or Chicago cover more ground, but for sheer mass, those structures were in a class by themselves. Gargantuan. There was a queer look about the place, though. You know how a terrestrial city sprawls out, a nimbus of suburbs, a ring of residential sections, factory districts, parks, highways. There was none of that here. The city rose out of the desert as abruptly as a cliff. Only a few little sand mounds marked the division, and then the walls of those gigantic structures. The architecture was strange, too. There were lots of devices that are impossible back home, such as setbacks in reverse, so that a building with a small base could spread out as it rose. That would be a valuable trick in New York, where land is almost priceless. But to do it, you'd have to transfer Martian gravitation there. Well, since you can't very well land a rocket in a city street, we put down right next to the canal side of the city, took our small cameras and revolvers, and started for a gap in the wall of masonry. We weren't 10 feet from the rocket when we both saw the explanation for a lot of the queerness. The city was in ruin, abandoned, deserted, dead as Babylon, or at least so it looked to us then, with its empty streets, which, if they had been paved, were now deep under sand. A ruin, eh? Commented Harrison. How old? How could we tell? Countered Jarvis. The next expedition to this golf ball ought to carry an archaeologist, and a philologist too, as we found out later. But it's a devil of a job to estimate the age of anything here. Things weather so slowly that most of the buildings might have been put up yesterday. No rainfall, no earthquakes, no vegetation is here to spread cracks with its roots. Nothing. The only aging factors here are the erosion of the wind, and that's negligible in this atmosphere, and the cracks caused by changing temperature. And one other agent, meteorites. They must crash down occasionally on the city, judging from the thinness of the air and the fact that we've seen 4 strike the ground right here near the Ares. 7, corrected the captain. 3 dropped while you were gone. Well, damage by meteorites must be slow anyway. Big ones would be as rare here as on Earth, because big ones get through in spite of the atmosphere, and those buildings could sustain a lot of little ones. My guess at the city's age, and it may be wrong by a big percentage, would be 15,000 years. Even that's thousands of years older than any human civilization. 15,000 years ago was the late Stone Age in the history of mankind. So Leroy and I crept up to those tremendous buildings, feeling like pygmies, sort of awestruck and talking in whispers. I tell you, it was ghostly walking down that dead and deserted street, and every time we passed through a shadow, we shivered. And not just because shadows are cold on Mars. We felt like intruders, as if the great race that had built the place might resent our presence, even across 150 centuries. The place was as quiet as a grave, but we kept imagining things and peeping down the dark lanes between buildings and looking over our shoulders. Most of the structures were windowless, but when we did see an opening in those vast walls, we couldn't look away, expecting to see some horror peering out of it. Then we passed an edifice with an open arch. The doors were there, but blocked open by sand. I got up nerve enough to take a look inside, and then, of course, we discovered we'd forgotten to take our flashes. But we eased a few feet into the darkness, and the passage debouched into a colossal hall. Far above us a little crack let in a pallid ray of daylight, not nearly enough to light the place. I couldn't even see if the hall rose clear to the distant roof, but I know the place was enormous. I said something to Leroy, and a million thin echoes came slipping back to us out of the darkness. And after that we began to hear other sounds, slithering, rustling noises, and whispers, and sounds like suppressed breathing, and something black and silent passed between us and that faraway crevice of light. Then we saw 3 little greenish spots of luminosity in the dusk to our left. We stood staring at them, and suddenly they all shifted at once. Leroy yelled, "Ce sont des yeux!" And they were. They were eyes. Well, we stood frozen for a moment, while Leroy's yell reverberated back and forth between the distant walls, and the echoes repeated the words in queer, thin voices. There were mumblings and mutterings and whisperings and sounds like strange soft